Hi, everybody. My name's Hank. I'm an alcoholic. And I don't know if I'm... Is that better? Thank you, Bob. I'd like to thank Missy for for asking me to come here tonight. She phoned, and I said, of course. And then I said, uh-oh. But I am glad to be here. There's some stuff happening here, so it's, I don't know, it's just... I was really taken with all the birthdays here and the enthusiasm of this group. One of the things about Alcoholics Anonymous that I really, really like is the enthusiasm of the people who participate. And for a very long time in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I kind of showed up and didn't participate. And I consider it a real privilege now to do that, but I'll get into that later. And I need to tell you, and I need to probably tell Bob, incidentally, happy birthday, Robert. Bob is one of my dear friends, and I wish him the best. I brought my big book, and I even read it, you know, and I didn't just spill coffee on it. And you got to rip the pages a little bit to make it look like you did something, so that when all your AA friends come over, and then you got to stick it on your coffee table, see, and you know, and just. But it's really dog-eared now, and pages where I open it to and actually read it. The binding, the glue has come loose from the binding, and in a little while, when I get to what it's like now, I just picked this up tonight, and I'd like to go through it and tell you share with you some of the things that are in my big book, because some of the things that are in my big book are part of me and my recovery. And it may be a little odd way of doing things, but I thought I was terminally unique for a while, so you know, it's going to be a little different. I was, as most of you, I was raised in an alcoholic home, began drinking at a very early age, at the age probably of 14 when I started drinking alcoholically. And it's funny, the age 14 really rings a bell with me, because I've listened to a lot of speakers, and there must be something about puberty. I don't know. But most male people that I hear share from the podium say they began drinking at 14, and I did. And I drank to get drunk, and I drank to pass out, and I couldn't, so I just kept drinking. One of the things I remember in childhood that's carried through into my adult years is a reason I consider, other than the fact that I'm a drunk, that I drank was to get rid of fear in my life. I was afraid of everything. I was afraid of everybody. Bob, is this thing doing okay? Because it's kind of barking back at me here. I don't know, maybe it was dinner. I don't know. I could not get rid of my fear of you. I could not get rid of fear of life around me until I drank. And when I drank, and I heard Scott R. in California talk about it, when I drank, I found it. And he said after about 6 months he lost it, and he spent the rest of his time looking for it. Well, I found it when I first got drunk, and I continued to find it until shortly before I stopped drinking. I found a few other things too, and that's where the insanity came in, and I'll probably get into a little bit of that, although Karen probably hopes that I don't. The insanity part, the step 2 was an interesting part for me. Anyway, I went to a college. How do you like this? I matriculated, if I said the word, to a college, whereupon I got bounced out because I drank too much. And thank goodness there was a war for me to go to, and so I did that, and they sent me to some place called Spokane, Washington. And I said, where in the world is Spokane, Washington? But as I soon discovered when I got to Spokane, that I could go over to the state of Idaho and drink at the age of 19, which was wonderful, which, you know, I could drink on the base, I could drink there. I thought it was a normal thing for I didn't know anybody who didn't drink. I thought that's what I was supposed to do. At that time, I thought I held my liquor well. My wife will probably tell you otherwise. And it wasn't just the drinking, it was the behaviors, You know, the drinking allowed me, the behavior allowed me to remain 14. I thought like a 14-year-old. I still think like a 14-year-old from time to time. And it's, you know, and one of the beauties of the program is occasionally a person will bring me up short and remind me of that. And but going back to the fear thing, I could not get away from the fear of everything and everybody. And I ran as hard and fast as I could from coast to coast. I got out of the military. I was fortunate not to have gotten into any big trouble. I went back to the East Coast. At that time, I had acquired a wife and child, and drank a whole lot and lived like a 14-year-old, you know, content with my resentments and my fear. And I stumbled along for a number of years until I got a really huge resentment and said, look, I'm going back to Spokane where things are better. So I got on an airplane and flew back to Spokane. And as I remember vaguely, they let me ride first class where I could get very drunk. And I was met at the airport by a lady to whom I'm married now. And I said, let's go to the cocktail lounge. So that goes to show you where I was at that point in my life. I was still running. I had told my wife back there in New York, I said, I don't care what you do, sell everything I got and then drive out here if you want to. So I was real considerate of them. By that time I had more children. I have been, at that point I didn't know what to do, so I got a job too, actually. And I'm a drunk. I had to have a way to buy the booze. Now, some people say they could get booze without a job. I couldn't. I wasn't smart enough, so I got 2 jobs so I could buy the booze I needed to get through life and to run from the darn fear. You know, I was so afraid, and I always did, you know, crazy stuff. You know, I drove race cars. I did that for years, and I don't remember seeing any of you out on the local tracks here, but some of you probably would like to beat me up after this meeting, and you're welcome to it. And I did things like that, but and I don't know if I invited fear to chase it away, but when we get to the steps, you know, in step 4, when we talk about the fear part, and, you know, I wrote lots of stuff on that, finally, but that's another story. I was divorced. I lost a family to probably my alcoholism, and remarried and married my best drinking buddy, I married somebody who had been a drinking partner for, I don't know, 15, 20 years. And I'm not going to get into her story because she'll relate that sometime, but suffice it to say that we were a great couple, and brought to the marriage 4 children, some of whom were in their teen years. And, you know, you talk about the insanity when I would bring the kids to Albert's or Tidyman's in the morning, Sunday morning, to buy my 10 gallons of wine every Sunday. And it's, hi, Mr. Mankin, having another party. Yeah, you betcha. And, you know, the whole time, I think the theme of this talk is fear, because fear, the drinking kept the fear at bay. I reached a point in 1980 where I didn't know quite what to do. I didn't know much about alcoholism, even though I'm a child of alcoholics, and that I'm a drunk myself. I knew nothing of recovery. I had never heard of a treatment center. Although I can remember one time, and this is an interesting story, in August of 1980, I can remember seeing an ad for a place called Raleigh Hills Hospital on the television. And I thought, oh, well, maybe I do have a problem with alcohol, but if I go there and nobody knows me, I can get some information. I drove up to the front door of Raleigh Hills Hospital in August of 80 on a red farm tractor, thinking nobody would see me. And I walked in, and some folks with white jackets walked out, and I said, hi, Doc, how you doing? And they had, in the front lobby, they had some information. And I thought I discreetly took some and put it in my bright red jacket, climbed on my red farm tractor and drove off. And it was located downtown on 5th Avenue near the freeway. So, you know, so we talk about insanity, you know. There was Henry on his farm tractor. A month later, I was reaching a point where I couldn't pull off this air of normalcy anymore. I didn't know how to stop drinking. You know, I couldn't not drink. I tried it. Every once in a while I could go one day, and then I'd feel so good I'd get doubly hammered. And I was running from that darn fear thing again, because when I'd stop drinking, that fear monster would come back, and the only thing I could make it go away with was alcohol. I was fortunate I had experimented with some other drugs, and I didn't like those because they weren't legal, you know. And so I came home one night on the 9th of September 1981, and I sat down at the kitchen table and I cried. And I told my bride that I just could not do this anymore, and I did not know what to do. And I'm not a crying kind of guy, you know. I probably never cried 5 times in my life, even though I was always afraid. And I said, I don't know what to do. And she said, well, maybe we could call this A&A place. Maybe, you know. So we went into the phone book. And one of the things, you know, I think I was blessed and cursed with it. I can remember all of this. I can remember the bad things I did. I never had blackouts. You know, I can remember all the crappy stuff I did. But I can remember this night. And I phoned AA, and there was a lady who came on and said, I'm sorry, but there's not a man available to take a call tonight. What a woman do? And I said, I will talk to a goat if it will help me. You know. And there's a lady who's very dear to me in the program who's here in Spokane who took the call and said, honey, you don't have to take another drink if you don't want to, and here's what you can do. And she asked me where I lived, and I told her, and she said, and this was a Thursday night, and she said, Monday, there's a real nice meeting close to your home. And I said, I can't wait till Monday. I need to do something. And now that was a higher power, because I didn't know. And she said, well, honey, my home group meets on Friday night, and it's clear up on the South Hill. And I said, I'll be there, and I was. And I haven't had to have a drink since the 9th of September of 81, and for that I'm grateful. Thank you. I went to that meeting, and there were probably 40 people in that room who had bright eyes, not shiny, reflecting back kind of eyes, you know, but bright eyes. I saw people who looked comfortable in their skin. I saw people who could say whole sentences, you know. I saw, and some who couldn't, but most who could. I was one of the latter. It struck me that they must have something really neat there. And some people say they came into AA and hated it. I walked into that room, I felt peace in that room, and something told me I didn't have to drink anymore. I don't know what it was. I felt like a burden had been lifted off my shoulders at that point. I was so happy to be in a room full of people who didn't drink. They looked a little weird, but I didn't, you know. I remember the meeting. I was toxic as heck, and none of you remember that probably. But, you know, I had that booze coming through the pores of my skin as I sat there and sweat. But I was grateful to be there. And after the meeting, this guy came up to me and he said, you know, after this meeting, we go out for coffee and pie. I go, right. Why don't you come with me? Right. But I did, you know. And there were probably 20 of them from the meeting who went to this place and sat down there and drank coffee and ate pie. And I thought, this must be a strange cult, but they're not drinking, so it must be okay. The guy became my first sponsor. And I need to tell you at that point, and I'm not real proud of this, but I don't know if it was God or I who picked this person as my sponsor, but I never worked the steps. I was able to stay sober, and this was a wonderful friend of mine, but we never spoke of steps. And do you know that you can probably go to 10 meetings a week in Spokane and never really have to hear about the steps? I stayed away from them. I wasn't going to do that stuff. You know, it was good enough that I didn't have to drink. And apparently my higher power saw to it that that was the way it was to be for a while. And But I came home and I spoke with my wife and I said, this is really great. I think I can do this. And I'll come back next Friday to the next meeting. And I got to tell you, folks, for the first 6 months, I, honest to God, didn't think that there was more than one meeting a week in Spokane. But I kept going to that meeting. And after about a month and a half, my wife asked me about it. And incidentally, she had stopped drinking on that day with me. For my sake, of course. I am an alcoholic, and there's probably another 12-step program for her. But after about a month and a half, 2 months, she asked me about it. She said, I think I need to straighten these people out. And this guy who says he's your sponsor, and she commenced to join me. So my life partner has come through high and hell water with me, and there's more to that story. I spent my first 10 years in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous happier than heck that I didn't have to drink, but not doing anything about my alcoholism. My higher power probably did, and you people probably did for me, but Hank didn't do anything for his alcoholism. Hank didn't drink, and I did things. I went to 3-4, finally, when I discovered there was more than one meeting, I went to 3 or 4 meetings a week. I had a sponsor who specifically had never worked the steps, so I didn't want to work the steps. I had guys whom I sponsored, and I'm not proud of this, but they never worked the steps, and some of them even stayed sober in spite of it. And so there is a higher power. There's a power greater than me, because I was able to stay sober. I was able to keep my family, raise my children, and that was interesting. 4 daughters, 1 year between each of them, and I don't know. That was pretty interesting, but that's another story. And there is another 12-step program for that. When I was 10 and a half years sober, I reached a turning point in my life, or as my sponsor calls it, a crossroads. I engaged in certain behaviors that nearly cost me my life. I engaged in behaviors that, when it was brought out, I could not deal with. I had had enough Alcoholics Anonymous program in me to realize what I had done was completely unacceptable to the way we live as recovering people. And I had to make a decision. And with the help of the higher power and my bride, and some very, very good people in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I was able to make a decision at the crossroads to work the program. Not my program, the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I got a sponsor who is a very nice man, and he's very gentle, but he's direct. And he told me, you've been around long enough, you will be in my study every Thursday night at 7 o'clock. And every week we're going to work a step. And you're going to write it out, and you're not going to die, you're going to live. Or if you want to die, he said, go right ahead. I work the steps, and I've written some, I won't use it from the podium, but I've written some obscenities in this book. I have written a lot of obscenities in a 12 and 12. And sometime if you ever in my home, I'll show you my 12 and 12. Because you talk about a guy who's worked with half measures for 10 and a half years, who all of a sudden needs to work steps 6 and 7. From the 12 and 12, you know where I'm coming from. It was a real exciting program for me. When I got to step 2, step 1 I had worked pretty darn well. Step 2, when I got talking about the insanity in my life, and there were some really crazy things. Case in point, buying those 10 gallons of wine on every Sunday morning. Having another party, Mr. Mankin, and. I met a lady who just happened to be pregnant, and she told me, and I said, well, I'll marry you. I did things like that, It's not the wife I'm married to now. Oh, that's right. Share in a general way. Anyway, but insanity. You know, I did some insane things, and it never crossed my mind that this was insanity. You know, this was active alcoholism. So I got to write that down. I did my fourth step. And my fourth step, I'd been afraid to do it, and my sponsor presented it to me in a real non-threatening way. He said, we don't use the fourth step to beat you up with. All we're doing is taking a look at Hank. That's all we're doing with step 4. Take a look at Hank. Okay. I could do it that way. And that's why when I sponsor newcomers and I talk to newcomers, you know, some people are afraid of the steps, you know, and they can be presented, I think, in a non-threatening way. Step 5 was relatively easy for me because we worked on 4 together. Step 6 took me 3 weeks. Step 7 took me 3 weeks. It was decided that, oh, no, I'm unhappy. In those steps, I found that I had a really big ego. Can you imagine that? And I had to do something about it, and I had to understand humility, and I read it and read it and read it, and I just absolutely have, and to this day, I have a horrible time with steps 6 and 7. And well, you probably know why. You know, that's. But working the steps was very important to me. Working the steps saved my life. You know, I had to become teachable, and that was a point where I became teachable when I knew that, because I had 2 options at 10 and a half years of sobriety. I didn't want to drink. I didn't want to use drugs. You know, but I really wanted to die. I couldn't use alcohol. I didn't want to use alcohol. So it was brought to my attention that maybe you suffer from untreated alcoholism. Well, duh. You know. And so I did that, and then I moved on, and I wrote my list of step 8 of people I needed to make amends to, and that, you know, that grew. And some I made direct amends right there. Much of my blood family is 3,000 miles away. I had to wait a bit to make face-to-face amends. I was able to go back. My poor mother, who suffered from alcoholism terribly, and it killed her, I was able to make amends at her grave. I was able to make amends to that old SOB who was my father, and who, when he died, all of a sudden he's not an SOB anymore. You know, he's just the old man who suffered alcoholism. And this was kind of an interesting one. I had amends to make to a woman. She's a grandmother now, and I hadn't seen her in about 33 years. And the last time I'd seen her when I was a freshman in high school, and for some reason or other, I felt I needed to make amends. So I went back east, and I phoned her up, and I made my amends on the phone to her. And she thanked me. She said, "Thank you, Hank. You're still a jerk, but thank you anyway." You know, 33 years later. But I was able to do that. I was able to make amends to my children verbally, and I found that there was no other way I could really make amends to my children other than to make living amends. And I can be a good father, and I can be a good grandfather to their children, because I wasn't a real good father when they were growing up. And I told them this: I can't change this, but I can be a good father to you now. Which means I ain't going to give you a lot of money, but I can, you know. Anyway, and I try to be a good father to my children, and I try to be a really good grandfather to my grandchildren. And a lady asked me a couple of days ago, what gives you joy in your life? And my first answer was my family. And that was not the answer a long time ago. A short time ago, that wasn't my answer. So there have been changes made in Hank's life. You know, I have an appreciation of my family that I never had before. I have love for my family. I do some things that I don't. You know, I do some things that the selfish part of me doesn't want to do. I do service work. I don't do it well sometimes, but I do service work. You know, I suit up and I show up, and I go to meetings, and. I go to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'll come and speak, and there is still enough untreated alcoholism in me that the last couple of days I felt uncomfortable about being here. And normally I don't have a problem speaking in front of strangers, but you folks aren't strangers. I have a real problem speaking in front of people I know, and I know most of the people in this room. And this is what is kind of scary, because you guys know me. You know, you guys have gone through, there are a number of people in this room who were in this room when I came here. And you knew me when I came in that as a newcomer in that door, just a shaking and smelling like wine. And I'm going to cut this short pretty quick because Meg and Jay are starting to yawn. But this that's good. But I have learned a few things in this program. I've learned that I need to grow up and become an adult, and that's probably the foremost thing for Hank. This is what the program of Alcoholics Anonymous gives me a plan to become an adult. Those of you who know me better know I have a real difficult time with adulthood. It really scares the heck out of me when I get up in the morning, have a shower, and stand in front of that mirror to shave, and this balding middle-aged guy looks back, and I still feel like I'm that 14-year-old kid before I step in front of that mirror, you know. And I need to, I'm up to about maybe 16 and a half now, so I'm working on it. And I'm a slow learner. But I wanted, before I go, I just wanted to share a couple of things with you that are in my big book. And these things were not in my big book until 5 years ago. And probably, well, I actually probably started about 7 years when this goof from Omaha showed up and started talking about doing the steps and reading the book. And I said, what an idiot, you know. And I'm not, you know, and, you know, in spite of me, he's my brother now, so I love you, Robert. But I'm looking at stuff. I have a meeting schedule. Imagine that. I have, this is probably boring to you, but it means a lot to me because I've come a long ways. I have a men's group list with their phone numbers. Men, can you imagine that? The guy who would only talk to women, you know? I have a home group list of my home group that I show up at every week that I'm in town. You know, I love my home group. Besides that, I can eat there every Sunday morning, and I feed my other addictions. That's not AA related. I have... In case you don't know, Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship designed and administered by a bunch of ex-drunks whose only qualification for membership is that they can't hold their liquor and don't want to learn how. It has no rules, dues, or fees, no nothing that any sensible organization seems to require. At meetings, the speakers start on one subject and end up talking about something entirely different, concluding by saying, I don't really know anything about the program except that it works.
Perfect.
I have Walt C.'s address and phone number. For those of you who remember Walt C. I don't know. I have a person in the program's phone number, work and at home. Can you imagine that? I can phone somebody at work and not have their employer say, get that bum off the phone. For the newcomer in Al-Anon. I wonder how that got there. I have a flyer for the 1996 Pockets of Enthusiasm Roundup. I have these things in my big book now. You know, these things weren't in my big book until recently. And these things tell me that I'm involved in Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm involved in my recovery. And I really need to be involved. And I whined to Karen about speaking tonight, and I probably whined to a few of you. Okay, I like that. But you know what? I got to share a piece of myself with you, and I would not share this with anybody other than the people in this room. You know, people like you people, because I don't know what it is, but I always wanted to be like somebody else. You know, I didn't want to be a little hanky-mank, and I just wanted to be. I always thought that I'd want to be like Scott because he dresses cool. He really does, and he's and he's got it together. And this and that. No, and I see, but I compare. I still do this. I compare myself. Now here's a young guy who's got it all together, and he dresses cool, and he drives a slick truck, and so I'm not really fixed yet. So I got to keep coming to the meetings because I want to learn to be like Hank. That's what I want to do, and maybe before I die, I can do that. That I won't have to be like Mike or be like Scott. Maybe I can just be like Hank, and I think that's why my higher power put you, the steps, and the traditions in my life. Thank you.